As you may be aware, this is World Population Day, and the Sustainable Population Australia Victorian branch, which it's my honour to be the president of, decided that we should do a little forum to have a discussion of that, and essentially noting that since World Population Day this time last year, there are another 80 million of us in the world, and the question in our minds is whether that's a good thing or not. Our forum is titled, Can We Curb Our Growth Obsession? Is Bigger Always Better? And I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. And our first speaker is Michael Bayliss. Michael is the Communications Manager for Sustainable Population Australia. He's a long-term grassroots environmental activist with a particular interest in post-growth societies. So thank you, Michael, and over to you.
Thank you, Kelvin. And normally I talk from notes, pretty free-form, but I decided on this occasion to try something different and actually read word from word. I've never actually done that before, public speaking. But this is basically an article that I've done for Independent Australia that was published a few days ago, comparing Australia to other countries around the world. So World Population Day is quite a poignant day for many of us in the population sustainability movement. The UN is projecting a population of over 11 billion by the end of the century. Australia is heading for a doubling to 42 million in under 35 years from now. This means that our per capita footprint will need to halve by then just to break even on our current emissions. Australia responded to the challenge by voting for more of the same over the next 3 or so years on the mantra of growth and jobs. This is the same government that has been desperately trying to crank growth on behalf of the property and business sectors since the John Howard era. Why is this so? Australia's economy is centred on the belief that we need gross domestic product, or GDP, as a means of measuring prosperity. For this to happen, we need to maintain a culture of consumption coupled with a continually growing population. Whilst this is problematic for obvious reasons, GDP tells us nothing about quality of lives, and it gives no regard to the depletion or degradation of natural resources. We are generally told by almost everyone with money and power that without growing infinitely in a finite planet via the holy grail of GDP, we will either all die destitute and unloved, or worse still, vote in an extreme right-wing fascist government. The alternatives don't sound that great on paper. However, as quoted by policy researcher Jess Barrington-Shaw, beyond a certain point we find that growth erodes the quality of people's lives because it starts to extract too much from people and the environment. However, believe it or not, there are some nations around the world who are exploring progressive alternatives to the growth-based paradigm. Whilst we are not exactly spoilt for choice, and the alternatives that we do have are far from perfect, some of these countries are making some tentative steps to break away from the norm, and some of these surprisingly close to home. Australia's closest neighbour across the Tasman, New Zealand, is proving to be an anomaly in the Anglosphere, as Australia, UK, Canada and the USA appear to be grappling with an uneasy choice between business as usual and right-leaning populism. New Zealand has managed to avoid this trapping. Under the Jacinda Ardern Labor government, New Zealand is showing some promising early signs that a progressive alternative is possible. For example, New Zealand is distancing itself from the GDP economic model, and instead, as quoted by the New York Times, moving away from more traditional bottom-line measures like productivity and economic growth, and instead focusing on goals like community and cultural connection and equity in well-being across generations, and that no other major country has so explicitly adopted well-being as its objective. In New Zealand's wellbeing budget, there is less emphasis on growth and tax cuts, with a larger emphasis on supporting mental health, reducing poverty, lifting opportunities for Indigenous people, and transitioning to a low-emissions economy. If a happiness budget can be measured by the contentedness of its people, then New Zealand has already succeeded. The country is rated 8th on the World Happiness Index report. Things are still at an early stage, but even if this turns out to be all talk and little substance, the mantra of mental health and low emissions economy is still a welcome change from the "we're open for business and jobs and growth" rhetoric that Australia has become so habituated to. New Zealand is also managing to lower economic migration while still embracing multiculturalism. This may sound like a contradiction to many people, but this does not need to be the case. According to the New Zealand Labor Party policies, in recent years our population has been growing rapidly as record numbers of migrants arrive here. This has happened without the government planning for the impact immigration is having on our country. This has contributed to the housing crisis, put pressure on hospitals and schools, and added to the congestion on roads. We will take a breather on immigration. We will do this by making sure that work visas are not being abused to fill low-skill, low-paid jobs, whilst ensuring that businesses can still get the skilled workers they need. The population debate in Australia remains a contentious issue for many progressives, as any mention of migration is stifled for fear of its association with protectionism at best, or xenophobia at worst. New Zealand has demonstrated that it is actually possible to have policies which slow down economically fueled migration whilst not comprising on their progressive policies or the country's renowned openness to multiculturalism and diversity. For example, the way in which Jacinda Ardern responded to the recent shooting tragedy made global headlines. She responded with tact, diplomacy, grace and solidarity with the Muslim and Islamic communities following the shootings, and so far this has fostered an environment of healing and connection when hostility and division could have so easily have prevailed. It is important to reinforce that the rate of population growth does not necessarily improve multiculturalism, especially under a neoliberal model which treats humans as numbers. Further, in Australia, developer-led population growth is intertwined with the housing development economy, which forces gentrification and dispersal of communities towards the urban fringe. The fact that the NZ government, within this context, can openly question and act on the economic drivers of population growth is food for thought for Australians as we continue this emotive and protracted debate over migration. Another example of doing nice things is Costa Rica, and I recall my surprise when I first read about the progressive policies of this small American nation of 5 million people. Although geographically small, Costa Rica is certainly not short of ideas. After abolishing its military earlier in the 20th century, Costa Rica has instead redirected their budget towards education, health and social security. Costa Rica is also attempting to transition away from a GDP growth model towards a model that favours well-being over consumption. So far, Costa Rica's successes are many. The country's GDP per capita is a quarter of ours. However, Costa Rica tops the list in the Happy Planet Index. Literacy rates and gender equality are at international standards, and the country is a world leader in terms of environmental protection. Much of the country is environmentally protected, with most of the revenue coming from ecotourism. 99% of its energy comes from renewable sources. Interestingly, Costa Rica's fertility rate has declined to replacement level and its population growth is slowing in the past decade, now averaging about 1% per annum, despite the high flux of refugees into the country. Japan has a declining population and GDP, and therefore has been dismissed by many economists as a basket case. However, David Pilling, who wrote the book The Growth Delusion, found a different reality in Japan, including low unemployment, high quality social services in the healthcare sector, and a rising standard of living. As a closeted anarchist myself, I feel the need to mention Rojava, the de facto autonomous region in northeastern Syria that is doing utopian-sounding things such as decentralisation, gender equality, environmental sustainability, and pluralistic tolerance for religious, cultural, and political diversity. Naturally, the world stage treats this state with general contempt. Look Rojava up sometime on Google or on Google progressive search engine after this event. As I wrap up my talk, World Population Day is a wake-up call to the modern human experiment of perpetual growth on a finite planet that is choking us. This is a time of dramatic contrast where Extinction Rebellion protesters in France were tear-gassed on the country's hottest day on record. It is a time when Canada declares a climate emergency one day and approves the tar sands pipeline the next. It is a time, this actually happened, this is a time when many nations are rebelling against global economics by voting in dangerous right-wing populist governments, including Hungary, Brazil and the USA. Australia has elected more of the same jobs and growth for all the wrong reasons as our population grew by 400,000 in under a year. This rate of growth alone will contribute more to Australia's CO2 emissions, 6 million tonnes when per capita consumption is multiplied, than the annual emissions of the new Adani mine, which is predicted around 750,000 tonnes per annum. It is a time when it is important to look for countries out there that are genuinely exploring alternatives to GDP and endless growth. The future of the planet literally depends on it, in my opinion.
Now, I'm going to give people an opportunity to ask questions, of course, but I thought I'll give the other speakers the chance to speak, and then we'll have a general session for questions. Our next speaker is Bronwyn Plarre. Bronwyn is an activist who's worked with the Climate Guardians and Galilee Blockade, among other groups. She's an active member of Urban Coop, an organisation that is focused on community-based resilience. So thank you very much for coming along, Bronwyn, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Kelvin. And you might also know me through Climate Action Wall and a number of other climate activisty things. I don't public speak. And I've got some scratchy notes here, and I'm going to refer to a couple of these reports, and hopefully you'll understand my message. Yes, I'm a member of the Urban Coop co-housing group, and I'd love to say that it's because of the association with Urban Coop and Nightingale that my living room looks out onto a silo that's painted with a beautiful artwork of Jacinda Ardern hugging the unknown Muslim woman. It's just gorgeous, and that's happened through a different way of living and communicating. I know it's very, I don't know, it's very middle of the road in some ways, and I'll answer questions that you might have about the Urban Coop and its association with the Nightingale Housing Foundation later, but it's because of that that I have this beautiful image. So a little bit about me. I grew up in a small capitalist household manufacturing and retailing cakes, and worked in that business for the first part of my life. I retrained in a year that literally sort of changed my life. I didn't know it then, but it has looking back. I retrained as a horticulturalist at Burnley Horticulture College in either 1989 or 1990. It was around that time that I had a climate class, and that climate class taught me about global warming and the greenhouse effect, and it was really serious. And that something was definitely going to be done about it. 1989-90. In 1987, the CSIRO had a conference in Australia. It was either Sydney or Melbourne, I'm not sure, on the greenhouse effect. And then in 1988, another conference with the Commission for the Future. And in 1990, it was the first assessment report from the IPCC. Australians were then known as the best informed on climate change of all of the global population. What's happened? What's happened in this 30 years since then? So it's been this gradual dawning for me of, yeah, I know about climate change. I know it's unequivocal, and have done since I was taught about it and did an assignment on it. But why have we gone backwards? When the science is just becoming clearer and clearer, but the denialism has become thicker and thicker with the greenhouse mafia, and their, the messages that they've taken out of the message book of the tobacco industry, of peddling doubt. And I read just the other day that it was quite a while ago that Peabody hired a very slick PR firm to describe coal as bringing people out of poverty. It's the energy that brings people out of poverty. In short, we're up against a huge lobby. Anyway, I also studied, did a permaculture design course that reinforced my understanding of how the globe is a closed energy loop, apart from the energy from the sun. So all the energy we've ever had has come from energy from the sun, including the renewable stuff. And we know that we can live with renewable energy only. So now it's 7.5 billion people. Australia is one of the worst per capita emitters in the world, and yet we will feel the effects of it also the worst. What I'd like to do is just quote from, I don't know whether anyone knows this report, a group called Breakthrough, pretty much run by David Spratt and now Ian Dunlop. They put lots of reports out. This is the latest. It literally illustrates how much of an emergency we're in. So this report's written by David Spratt and Ian Dunlop, and the foreword is by Chris Barry, retired admiral. And if you'll allow me to read from the report. In 2017-18, the Australian Senate inquired into the implication of climate change for Australia's national security. The inquiry found that climate change is a current and existential national security risk, one that threatens the premature extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life, or of the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for desirable future development. David Spratt and Ian Dunlop have laid bare the unvarnished truth about the desperate situation humans and our planet are in, painting a disturbing picture of the real possibility that human life on Earth may be on its way to extinction in the most horrible way. It's probably the only emotive part of the report. The rest is very clinical. If I can quote Will Steffen, said of the climate challenge, "It's not a technical or a scientific problem. It's a question of humanity's socio-political values. We need a social tipping point that flips our thinking before we reach a tipping point in the climate system. The implications far outweigh conventional geopolitical threats." That's all from Chris Barry. I might also mention just now that they're, if you look at their website, or if you just look up the word Homefront, I don't know whether anyone has seen Homefront. It's a 10-15 minute documentary, also put out by Breakthrough. It was put on at the Transitioning Films Festival, and it's the first of a number of talking heads on the climate emergency, and it's a military perspective. You know, it's not from Extinction Rebellion, it's from the top end. It has Sherry Goodman, who was former Deputy Undersecretary of Defence of the USA, Chris Barry, John Hewson, John Blackman, also from retired from IAAF, Michael Thomas, retired Major General of the Australian Army, Tim Costello, Paul Gilding, and Hugh Hunt, who's a Professor of Engineering. These are all people who've contributed to, to the message of the climate emergency. Let me read more about from this, because I find it really quite chilling. You'll be aware of the 1.5 degree report that the IPCC put out last year. That was a real step change from the Paris report, which talked about 2 degrees but trying to attain 1.5. This talks about the severity of 1.5 degrees, but it is still watered down politically. So it uses the science, but it only uses what it can measure, and there is a lot in climate science that can't be accurately measured, but it's known about. So they talk about scientific reticence. In 2007, security analysts warned that in the 2 previous decades, scientific predictions in the climate change area had consistently underestimated the severity of what actually transpired. As an example, in the IPCC 5th assessment report, sea level rises were tipped to range from 0.5 degree to 0.8 of a, 0.5 metre to 0.8 of a metre by 2100. But said levels are likely to levels above the likely range cannot be reliably evaluated. By way of comparison, the higher of the 2 US Department of Defence scenarios is a 2 metre rise by 2100. And the extreme scenario developed by a number of US government agencies is a 2.5 metre rise by 2100. Another example is the recent IPCC report, which projected that warming would continue by at the current rate of about 0.2 degrees C per decade and reach 1.5 degree mark around 2040. However, the 1.5 degree boundary is likely to be passed in half that time, by around 2030, and the 2 degree boundary around 2045, due to accelerating anthropogenic emissions, decreased aerosol loading, and changing ocean circulation conditions. The decreased aerosol loading is it's one that I needed clarification about. It's air pollution that reflects the temperature, so actually has a cooling effect, which when we stop emitting, which we have to do, we will get a kick in temperature rise. So these are all things that the IPCC report does not take into account. This is all evidence as to why we are in a climate emergency. I could read lots more about it. There are a number of reports here and you're welcome to take. So look, I won't read any more. And I would really encourage you to look at their website and to look at the Homefront movie documentary. I wanted to just mention a little bit more about emissions, reducing emissions and reducing population, or addressing the population problem. And really, from a climate point of view, it is the per capita emissions that are the problem. Australia's one of the 3 highest, I think, of all countries in their emissions. at 15.8, this is in 2015, metric tonnes of carbon dioxide. We're a bit below the US, and we're a bit below Saudi Arabia. New Zealand's about 7.6. So I've got lots of stats here, but what are some that stand out? China's 6.59. India is 1.58 until we start digging up Adani and sending it to India or Bangladesh.
Let's boost their figure.
Sorry?
Let's boost their figure.
Yes, yes. Global per capita average carbon emissions are 1.3 tonnes. That figure astounded me. Imagine the number of people that are below that number. So what do we do? I know the question often comes up about populations when I'm at a talk on climate change. And what's the answer to it? I've never had to answer it, but here I am trying to do it now. What do we do? There is the possibility of issuing everyone with a gun and see what that does. We could, glad you're laughing, we could also use Lisa Simpson's solution to climate change, which is to eat the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and it would do far more good than becoming vegan or not driving for the rest of your life. And you know, there are thousands in Extinction Rebellion, so I'm sure we could get 500 to eat the 500 CEOs. But I wondered about the inheritance laws, thinking it's probably not going to do us all that much good anyway. So what do we do? We have to lower our emissions. Literally, we have to lower our emissions. And that's why we're in a climate emergency, and I'd like to talk just a little bit about Extinction Rebellion.
You need to wrap it up, Bronwyn, so if you can do that.
Thanks, Kelvin.
Yep.
Look, what if I wait and field some questions on Extinction Rebellion? Probably, I know that some of you in the audience are already very aware of it. It started off in the UK, it's a movement, and it's got 3 demands. I'll tell you the 3 demands and then I'll wrap up. Truth in government, 0 emissions by 2025, certainly for the UK and Australia and all other rich countries, and reclaim democracy, or create a democracy fit for purpose through a citizens' assembly chosen through sortition. We need all of those 3 things to happen. Thanks.
All right. Our third speaker, Mark Allen, is an ex-town planner and environmental campaigner who co-founded Population Permaculture and Planning and started the holistic activism movement. So thanks very much for coming along, Mark. And over to you.
Thank you, Kelvin. Thanks. I'll try and feed a little bit into what Bronwyn said, but I'll start off by having a bit of a town planning rant, and then we'll see where that leads us. So like Michael, I decided to write this out, but we'll see how it goes. I may end up throwing the notes away, who knows. So when I studied to be a town planner, I did so because I thought that was how I could contribute towards healing the earth. Having been brought up in the Cotswolds in Britain, I knew that if done well, the way we build and develop can actually enhance landscapes. I also realised that unless we have a firm grip on land use planning, no amount of recycling or green energy will save us from the consequences of poor land management. But my studies taught me so much more than the mechanics of good planning. It also taught me how to think critically. And that, unfortunately, proved to be my downfall. Certainly as a professional planner, because I quickly woke up to the fact that town planning, at least in Australia, is intimately tied into the neoliberal growthist matrix that we're living in, and that there is nothing really that I could do from within the system to change that. And integral to this matrix is a population stroke development Ponzi scheme that is the antithesis of everything that we need to be doing in order to tackle the multitude of crises that the world is facing right now. Town planning is currently at best a form of damage control, but most town planners are so overworked that they have little time to make even token amendments, never mind challenge planning policy. In the last 20 years, Australia has become increasingly reliant upon population growth and development in order to prop up gross domestic product, GDP. And the result is rapidly increasing urban sprawl, poorly designed and poorly implemented densification, and a constant pressure on infrastructure so that we are always playing catch up. Now, Town Planning 101 says that infrastructure should always be in place ahead of development. But that cannot and will not happen under the current system, because the same neoliberal growthist ideology that rapidly grows our population for economic gain is the same ideology that seeks to minimize public expenditure. So it is a culture that abhors public debt while encouraging private debt. So we have a rapidly growing population and low investments in infrastructure. So we're always playing catch up, and we always end up with less than ideal planning outcomes. It encourages to find ourselves with huge mortgages for houses that in Scandinavian countries would be classified as glorified tents. It also forces us into longer and longer commutes, and it forces us to want to keep this Ponzi scheme in place for fear of falling house prices and the fear of waking up to find that your house you were in is worth less than you paid for it. In other words, we are forced into wanting to keep the show on the road, even if deep down we know it is a road to hell. Sadly, many progressives toe the same line that is perpetuated by the development lobby. That is, the idea that densification is a solution to urban sprawl. And they do so without acknowledging that under the current model, population growth has to be ongoing, and that even a long-term plan for it to level off is not an option. So under neoliberalism, the population has to keep growing. So densification will have to be ongoing as well. There's no levelling off. There's no plan to level off the population. As a result, densification will need to be ongoing. So in other words, unless we call for a whole-scale shift in paradigm, we will need to find ever-increasing ways to fit more people into our existing urban spaces, and ever more innovative and expensive ways of retrofitting infrastructure to compensate, whether it is sky rail or tunnels under the ground. And of course, this rapid densification isn't slowing sprawl at all. In fact, sprawl is accelerating, and there are two main reasons for this. Firstly, a large demographic of people do not want to live in an apartment. And secondly, and more crucially, our population is growing too fast for anything more than a fraction of it to be contained within the existing urban form. Increasing densities is a relatively slow process compared to developing greenfield sites. And the Property Council know this very well, which is why they promote urban consolidation to prevent sprawl, whilst also lobbying for pushing the urban growth boundary ever outwards. And they are also proponents of a big Australia, which is of course totally unsurprising. The problem for me has been that conversations that critique the unsustainable nature of using population growth as a means of growing GDP are difficult ones to have. Population is a difficult topic to discuss for many reasons, but what is important to emphasise is that any policy of immigration that isn't tied into a broader global approach to population is inherently unfair and inequitable. For example, the most generous of migration policies shuts out far more people than it can ever let in. Even the idea of open borders must presuppose that entire countries cannot be expected to empty themselves of people. This is why a more proactive approach to the population issue must underpin any approach that we have regarding the movement of people. But a bit more on that later. The neoliberal approach to population policy is arguably racist because it is tied into cutting foreign aid spending, especially the proactive sort that helps women to become empowered and have access to vital services such as family planning. It is also racist because it uses migrants as units to grow the economy rather than to grow sustainable communities, all the while using refugees as scapegoats and blaming them for increased congestion on our roads. What we need is a new approach to this situation of population that is tied in with a new approach to town planning. This has to be much more holistic and equitable than the current status quo. Crucially, it must fit in with the urgent work that is needed to mitigate the climate emergency. The urgency is very real, as Bronwyn has pointed out. What is important is that we do not get divided by pointless discussions on false dilemmas, such as, population versus per capita consumption. What we can do is we can be looking for common ground and building a movement that carries everyone along with it. What is critical is that sustainable town planning is at the centre of any new post-growth society that we create. The nature of the climate emergency is such that we must minimise all carbon-intensive development. Therefore, our primary focus needs to be on retrofitting what we already have, including the 82,000 homes and units that lie empty in Melbourne alone. In other words, we need to focus on retrofitting and better utilising our existing built stock, rather than demolishing robust houses and replacing them with cheaply built apartments that are mostly aimed at the investment market. Where housing stock is in too poor a state to be retrofitted, and there are quite a few of them in Melbourne, we need to replace them with co-housing style developments that are modelled around sustainable living, such as the models that are being developed by Bronwyn's organisation, Urban Coop. Crucially, we need to share these town planning approaches with the rest of the world as part of a wider policy of mutual aid, where countries share knowledge and information that will help to develop sustainable communities across the board. Part of that mutual aid must include the empowerment of women, and all women must have the right to choose the number of children that they want. Irrespective of whether or not population is seen as an issue, any future post-growth society must have empowered women at the front and centre. This is why building common ground between those people who do prioritise population as an issue and those who think it is a distraction is actually not all that difficult. All that is required is that all parties involved are willing to peel the onion back a layer and see where the common ground lies. And it is crucial that we do look for this common ground. The era of ideological posturing must end, and emphasis must be on building a movement that carries everyone along with it. We will not save the planet with one set of values alone. And the sooner we come to terms with this, the sooner we will save the planet. The focus on much needed behaviour change must underpin our approach to systemic change. If not, we risk repeating the mistakes of history. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. I just want to say I have a website called Holistic Activism, which feeds into a lot of the kind of approach that I'm trying to take now about how we can tie into the massive crises that we're facing now and how we can approach those. And we've also got leaflets about what I've been doing that people can get at the front, and I'm happy to expand on anything I've said in the questions and answers starting any minute now. Thank you.
All right, thanks to each of our speakers for their different and thoughtful perspectives, and it's over to the audience to ask questions.
Oh, sorry, I didn't have a question, I had a comment, but I'll wait until I...
Mark, what was your website again?
So it's Holistic Activism, all one word, .net.
What?
Holistic Activism, Holistic Activism, all one word, .net. And there's leaflets with all that information on it just there as well. You can pick one of those up. Cool.
Yeah, I have little in common with Tony Jones, but I am prepared to take comments. or actually, what people do is make their comment and say, "Do you agree?" at the end.
Yeah.
Question.
I live in the country, up Castlemaine Way. I grew up in Melbourne. I've been seeing the little brochures of the Sustainable Population Association at Castlemaine Railway Station for many years now, and I've been certainly tempted to join the association. I probably will after tonight. I totally agree with the perspectives that I've read in those brochures. I avoid coming down to Melbourne as much as I can because of the congestion and other factors. I've been well aware of Kelvin Thomson's proselytising on the issue for many years. I congratulate him. I've been involved recently in some of the protests that have occurred in Melbourne over climate change, specifically the kids' rallies. And so I just wanted to say that I think the generations, the older generations in our society have failed us. And I think the hope for the future, and even in the next few years, is with the teenagers and adolescents who are out on the streets campaigning against global warming and climate change. And I really think that we need to consider how we, as adults, work beside them. I want to, and have already joined Extinction Rebellion. I think that's a very promising movement. Hopefully Extinction Rebellion can work alongside, in a parallel way, with the kids movement. But I just wanted to say, what do you think, and this is addressed perhaps to Bronwyn, how can we perhaps work with the young people who are showing anger, commitment? They're not prepared to give up. They will not give up. They'll become more militant. They'll be out in the streets on October 7th in their thousands, sitting down, hopefully with a lot of adults like myself sitting down with them. How can we work with them, not to patronise them, not to push them down? How can we work with them so we have all the generations fighting in this cause against climate change and against the population madness?
Okay,
Beautiful. Thanks so much. I think Extinction Rebellion and the School Strike for Climate are a natural fit. They've already been working really well together. Yeah, there've been a couple of, I know of one action where there was a little bit of sort of argy-bargy as to whether it's the school climate action or it's Extinction Rebellion's. I mean, if that's all we've got to argue about, we're doing well. So yeah, on the 20th, September the 20th will be a really big strike, school strike. And they are asking everybody, every adult in every union, to strike with them.
Where, what and how?
Midday probably, the 20th, it'll be Friday. Friday has to be they're all Fridays. And it'll be in Melbourne. I don't know exactly where it'll be, but it'll either be Parliament House or State Library. Just follow the signs. Then the following Saturday as well, there's something, I'm not sure who's organising it. And then on the 7th of October, as you mentioned, there's going to be the start of rolling actions. And it'll be Extinction Rebellion as well as the school student strike. They have given us so much of a fillip. It's just been absolutely amazing. They're members of Extinction Rebellion as well, some of them. So there's lots of cross-pollination.
Okay, other questions? Jill?
Michael, you mentioned a wellbeing index, some international wellbeing index or something like that, to as opposed to measuring a success with GDP. Do you know what sorts of things they took into account in order to measure it? And I wonder if it could be applied here. Or...
Yeah, so it's to ensure that all the citizens have what they need, and things like water security and even physical intangibles such as community integration and mental health well-being are all taken into account. These are all things that GDP doesn't take into account. And it's interesting whenever you see a country adopt something like the Genuine Progress Indicator and or the Genuine Happiness Indicator, such as New Zealand, such as Costa Rica, even Bhutan, like on a World Happiness Index, they're all higher than Australia, which continues to slide. You know, we're a miserable lot compared to those countries. And you just think, you know, if we are trashing our country so much and our emissions are just the peak of the world, you'd think if you're doing all that, at least you can be bloody happy. But we're not. We're just polluting left, right and centre, and we've all got unhappy faces while we're doing it. So what's the point? And I think that's what these measures essentially are. It's just, what's the point of GDP? What's the point of fucking up everything in our radius if we're going to be miserable doing it? And you know, the things that make people happy, not how often they go to Westfields. It's basically how many people are talking to them and telling them they're important and loved. And that's universal. And I think those measures are trying to kind of bridge that gap.
I guess it's easier to measure unhappiness, as indicated by the number of people seeking assistance for their mental health.
Exactly. Yeah. Australia's doing well in the unhappiness index.
I do believe that the way we treat the earth is a reflection of our own inner trauma. So it doesn't surprise me that the more we harm the earth, that there is a correlation between our lack of inner dissatisfaction. I think the way we treat the outer is definitely a reflection of our inner trauma, and this is what holistic activism tries to deal with as well. It looks at the behaviour change and what we have to do as ourselves and how we can reconnect with the earth, get back to basics, so that we can build up a movement that is based on something deeper than just dealing with symptoms. Climate change is a symptom, a very serious symptom, but it's a symptom of something that's deeper.
And Edward Kennedy said the GDP measures everything except the things that make life worth living.
Yes.
But notwithstanding that, you look at budget night, all the political, economic, business commentary, GDP is there as the key performance indicator, except as Michael was pointing out in New Zealand. All right, other questions here?
There's a definite disconnect, I guess, in capitalistic society between nature and where humanity is going in terms of the way civilization or the lifestyles. And just look at how Indigenous people treat land compared to the way Westerners have, probably going all the way back to the Roman Empire. And there are just three examples which are contemporary for me. Is the fact that, I mean, there are plans for 7 to 9 mega mines in the Galilee Basin. When you look at before and after photographs of the tar sands mining in Canada, the aftershots are absolutely disturbing of how people can destroy nature in that particular way. And then number two, I guess on a more day-to-day basis, something that's not talked about a great deal is that the urban sprawl is often constructed on land that used to be used to grow food. And many outer suburbs of Melbourne, whether it's Epping, around there, or even Doncaster back in the 50s, or Dandenong, they're all farming areas.
Cranbourne, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely, it's a serious issue.
yeah. No one talks about that.
I think this is where the per capita consumption and population issue does meet a little bit, because under the capitalist model, you have to keep growing the consumer base. But what we're doing is we're eating into land that we should be growing food on. So what we're doing by doing that, apart from creating longer and longer commutes, which has its own environmental impact, and creating car dependency, which is a long-term environmental impact, we're also increasing the food miles for our food. So we want to be able to grow food as close to where we live as possible. And this is another reason why densification as a solution to urban sprawl isn't necessarily a good idea either, because the gardens of Melbourne can potentially produce a lot of food in the low carbon economy. And David Holmgren, bless him, has written a book called Retro Suburbia, which I strongly recommend you read, which is about how we can use these gardens in a new way in order to provide some of our food security. So we need to be protecting the gardens within Melbourne, and we also need to be protecting the food bowl on the urban fringe. So population policy under the capitalist regime, because it's tied in with GDP growth and the development lobby, is not going to lead to environmentally sustainable solutions. Now, Melbourne can contain a substantial amount of population growth within its existing built capacity, which is fine, but we also, of course, need to be looking at the international perspective and empowering communities so that people generally don't need or feel the need to move and migrate. Migration is something that shouldn't be the first approach to dealing with population. The first approach to population is about empowerment, education, access to family planning. If we get that right, and we get our approach to town planning right, hopefully the issue of migration over time will become less of an issue. Then there is the issue of climate refugees, which is another big issue, which I won't go into right now, but that will change everything.
Other questions? Ian?
I'd like my question to all the panel members. I really want to bring it back to the heading on the seminar, which is, can we curb our growth obsession? I'm hearing lots of problems with our growth obsession, but I'd love to hear from each of them about what particular action we can do to curb our growth obsession.
I'd like to
Go ahead,
have a
Michael.
start. Something that I would like to see more from residents groups and the population sustainability movement is we're all very aware of the damage that property developers do, and whatever we can do to bring the decision making of how and why we grow away from the property developers back into the hands of local councils and the community. In my not utopian ideal, but the way I see it working in my head is that residents groups take on a similar model to what Extinction Rebellion is doing, like civil disobedience in front of the offices of the property council. Just draw attention to you know what they're doing. I think a lot of attention goes, oh, maybe if we just vote in another political party, but what you're not doing is addressing the people who are bribing donating to most major political parties, which are the property developers and you know the negative gearers and of all that. So I think only direct action, which I haven't personally seen a lot of. I've seen elements of that in the time which I've been part of the movement, but I think it can go to that next stage. I think also, you know, inviting the ambassador of Costa Rica and New Zealand to talk in large groups of people of their personal experience, how their country got to go to this stage, like, and what's the psychology of the people, that they can do something different from what Australia is doing. So they're two of my ideas.
There you go, and thank you very much for concentrating us on the nut of the issue. I guess, and I love Michael's answer of direct action. I'd like to carry that a little bit further. I'd like to carry it actually a lot further. 30 years of inaction, 30 years of going backwards is what I see where we're at a climate change point of view, but also at you know, as the other two speakers have so well described, at a happiness and a well-being level, with greater personal depth. We're just going backwards. And because I didn't write my notes properly, what I didn't get to say, which I can say now, is if we actually do what Extinction Rebellion would like us to do, which is mobilise 3.5% of the population in an informed way, which I can talk about later, or as some of you may already know, what the modus operandi of Extinction Rebellion. It's very well thought out. It will give us the opportunity to design a brand new system fit for purpose. And that's what we need. we're going to need, I'm not an economist. I've loved reading the Kate Raworth book, Donut Economics. That's my level of economics. Whereby we design the economy within the parameters, the two parameters, the internal parameters are human conditions and the outer parameters are planetary conditions. And whatever we've got in the middle is what we can afford to spend. I don't know, it's our economy. I'd love to think that every decision maker, every decision maker at every level makes that decision through a lens of reducing our carbon footprint before the lens of the economy, which is the usual lens.
How we can curb our growth obsession? Well, it's going to come to an end very soon, whether we like it or not, because we've reached the peak of everything. We've reached the peak. We're just tinkering on the edge now of society collapsing as we know it. We're reaching, this is late stage capitalism now, and it's going to come to an end. What we can do is we can start the conversations now about how we can transition from this growth-based society that is coming to an end into something that is far, far more equitable, sustainable, resilient, that basically doesn't take us down the path towards extreme right-wing fascism, which is my biggest fear, like Michael's. We've seen that already in parts of the world, in Brazil, that populations at a time of crisis tend to veer to the right. It would be catastrophic if the same people who took us into this mess through neoliberalism reinvent themselves as far-right authoritarians. So we've got to have those conversations wherever and whenever we can. We've got to start talking about it, about how we can create a world that is not reliant upon endless growth on a finite planet, because time's up. We either change or we die. Simple as that. And direct action has to be part of that. And again, this is why Extinction Rebellion is going to be the movement that's going to carry this forward, building up momentum. I've joined Extinction Rebellion. Part of my role as a holistic activist is to make sure that Extinction Rebellion sticks to its terms of reference and doesn't destroy itself through divisive politics and bickering, which a lot of organisations have done in the past. So the great thing about Extinction Rebellion is they have 3 points, and they're pretty straightforward. As Bronwyn says, one of them is net zero emissions by 2025, and doing that, believe it or not, will end the growth-based economy. So that's great. And the nuance and the citizenship assembly. So what we need to do is we need to create a new form of democracy. And the idea of the citizenship assemblies that Extinction Rebellion talk about is critical. What we have to do is we have to find out new ways of connecting, not getting bogged down in cognitive dissonance, not getting bogged down in divisive issues, which is why, coming from a population perspective, where there has been a lot of tension, I'm very interested in how people who do think that population is an important issue, and I'm one of those people, I think that Africa's population doubling is a serious problem for Africa. That doesn't mean to say that I don't think that our per capita consumption needs to massively reduce, and that doesn't mean to say that I don't think that the 1% are the main cause of problems. I think all of these things. But, as I said earlier, irrespective of whether or not population is an issue, most people would agree that the empowerment of women and access to family planning and teaching communities to become resilient and self-sufficient needs to be the centre or part of a new post-growth society. So we need to peel the onion back a layer, and instead of looking for points of difference where we can argue on our ideological plinths, we need to say, okay, you have different values to me, we're not going to say the world with one set of values, let's find our point of connection where we can work together. That's how we banned fracking in Victoria. Greeners and farmers got together and stopped fracking in Victoria. One of great success. So yeah, behaviour change is important, so we've got to work on the behaviour change. Direct action, in-your-face direct action and keeping conversations going and letting people understand the fact that a society that's post-growth is possible. It's not, the world isn't going to fall in, and we can create a world that doesn't require endless growth and a finite planet.
Further questions?
Comment to some extent. Here's a question. We're probably pretty high on the misery index. I don't know that we're all that high up on the wellness and happiness index collectively. But I feel somewhat optimistic. I'm a 50-50. I spoke with Mark and Michael about the Sustainable Living Festival about that level of optimism or pessimism and how you deal with that mentally. And you had interesting responses to that. I'm 50-50. I think that there could be scientific breakthroughs. There could be a realisation that population really needs to be addressed worldwide, and the UN latest predictions of 9 billion, not 11, peaking at 2040, if fertility is reduced by half a child per woman, would see peak population at around 8 to 9 billion. So there is room for optimism in that, I think. And I'd just like to have a little bit of feedback about whether you think there's cause or room for much optimism. And I've heard your response before. I'm interested if you've changed. It sounds to me as if you've gotten worse.
I don't think we'd be here if we were all optimistic about. I mean, we might be optimistic about our personal lives and what we're doing. And if I were optimistic about the world not coming to a horrible end, I wouldn't be here tonight. I'd be at home doing my knitting.
Oh, no, it's not clear cut.
I'll let Michael and Bronwyn answer first, and then I'll have a little rant.
It's because on my, this sounds so general, but on my Facebook feed, there's a group called Inspired Evolution, and so my Facebook feed is full of this horrible, we're all going to die, we're going to be eating each other soon. But then there are these things of the amazing things that people are doing, like the first hemp wood brick making factory, and these fog nets that capture the fog and create water to sustain, remote communities in Peru, and just these amazing innovation things that people are doing that do look. Jackets made of kombucha scobies, which is probably the next level of hippism, but Melbourne soon will be self-sufficient in leather jackets, just to the scobies alone, but I always get these little glimmers of hope. I always hope that the glimmer of hope will become more of a glimmer and more of a shining light in my face. It's never got to quite to that stage yet.
I'm basically a Pollyanna, which I'm pretty sure is a glass more than half full person. And I think I am that because I've been formed by permaculture. I keep falling back on the philosophy in permaculture. I love David Holmgren's book. I get a lot of hope also from the Paul Hawken Drawdown book, even though I find it a bit confusing. It confuses drawdown with emissions reduction, but nevertheless there's lots of amazing examples there. And I just read recently about bricks made from mycelium. The wood wide web is actually mycelium that allows plants to talk. And there's huge potential in soil carbon. And therefore, how we grow our food, how we could grow our food using no fossil fuel inputs, but probably a fair bit more human input, and of course growing plant-based, seasonal, local foods. The population thing, and if anyone were to read this report, they'd soon get the idea that population growth is actually going to curb itself through climate catastrophe, through inundation, through, you know, longer, anything from 20 to 100 days a year of heat stress in some of these major built-up cities. So for me, it's not an issue of overpopulation. It certainly is one of the per capita emissions. That's that fairness thing, let alone legacy carbon. But it's one of climate refugees. Of, you know, where are people going to be able to live? Where are they going to want to live? Those that survive.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It started off optimistic and got quite pessimistic. But that's the way it is. That's the reality of the situation.
You're right.
That's exactly
right.
it. You know, and they say, you know, a pessimist is a well-informed optimist. Look, I know an optimist. I know a few optimists, and they don't do a lot. Not all optimists are like that, but some are just like, yeah, electric cars will save us. We're all right. You should be all right. Optimism hasn't got us very far so far. I understand the need for optimism for some people because I don't want to associate pessimism with giving up. So if pessimism means giving up, please don't be a pessimist. Please be an optimist because we don't want anyone to give up. But Extinction Rebellion, I've noticed, are not mincing their words. They are mobilising people because they're telling people how serious the situation is. We are fighting for our lives and we need to be aware of that this is very, very serious, and acknowledging the fact that it is serious means acknowledging the fact that we might not succeed. I'm not big on optimism personally, but I find that courage is important, and courage means doing the best you can irrespective of the result. So I'm not interested in whether or not we're going to save the planet per se. I'm interested in that we do everything we can to try and save the planet. But a little part of me stays pessimistic because there is that grief. I need to be able to grieve for what's happening. I need to be able to grieve for what could happen. I need to be able to grieve for this immense suffering that's ahead of us, for those millions of people in countries. I mean, India, there are cities in India that are about to run out of water, you know. And so I don't want to be an optimist or a pessimist, but what is important is that we really show the urgency of the situation and the seriousness of the situation and act quickly.
All right. Other questions?
Yes.
Hamish?
I'll try. I haven't really got it framed in my head, but looking at the current system of economics, when we're talking about post-growth and the huge problems that we have with the way things are going and working, but to some extent, economics, when the externalities are priced in, can theoretically work. I mean, for example, if fresh water was valued at its real price, it wouldn't be $1 per 1,000 litres or something. And if we applied a value to nature and forests, we would end the logging industry tomorrow. So my question is, in all this, to what extent would the right incentives, the right carrot and stick, if you like, around, let's say, a family of 4 versus a family of 1, just as a crude example on population, to what extent can this carrot and sticks work to sort of shape the goals of Extinction Rebellion and everything else, or is effectively money and economics just has got us so far down the wrong track that you don't really want to talk about incentives and subsidies and etc.
Maybe take that little bit on Extinction Rebellion. The Extinction Rebellion don't have a list of solutions. They, I think, very generously gift that to the Citizens' Assembly. And it's a Citizens' Assembly through sortition, which is similar to the jury duty. where people are informed of the problem that they are going to be judging and talking about. And exactly how those people get informed is a question I still have. I'd love further discussion about it within the Extinction Rebellion circle. But I certainly would rather see, at this late stage, I'd rather see regulatory change than commodification of further, resources. This is what Extinction Rebellion want, to make enough noise to actually have a seat at the table, to be heard, to make sure that truth is spoken. And it hasn't been spoken for 30 years. Longer, probably. I don't know, I just woke up, I've been slowly waking up over these 30 years. Let me pass on.
All right. Are there any other final questions before we wrap it up? If not, I might...
Can I just say one quick
Yep.
little extension to that about the importance of citizenship assemblies and how we must create a world where people are taught to think critically, so critical thinking, finding ways of connecting with people, interpersonal skills, non-violent communication. These are all issues that we need to bring into the citizenship assemblies so that we create informed, decent conversation and debate so that we don't end up repeating the mistakes of history. So behaviour change, I think, has to be a fundamental part of citizenship assemblies. That's it. Thank you.
All right.
And if I could just have one last thing, if you don't wrap up, Kelvin.
Yeah.
And that's to just mention this report, which I brought, written by Jane Morton, and she does talk about the language, how our language needs to change, but how we should not hold back and say it like it is. Talk about the emergency. It does scare people, and it does inculcate grief in people because it means huge change. But it's only that will get the appropriate action. So I recommend it.
All right. I do want to bring things to a close, although we've got some biscuits and wine down the back there and cheese, which we invite people to stay behind and have a yarn if they're in a position to do that. I want to thank the speakers, and I want to use the opportunity I have as MC to make a few reflections in closing. First, while we've been having this discussion, the population of the globe has increased by around 1,500, so this is relentless. 200,000 a day, 1.5 million each week, 80 million each year. And to the gentleman at the front who said, are we potentially stabilising? Throughout my life, demographers have said that population will take care of itself, that it will level out and even reduce. And for many years I believed them. However, for the last decade, I've decided that they are talking nonsense, because every time when you look at what actually happens, the population growth is higher than their predictions. So essentially, the history of global population is bouncing along like this, and then in the course of the last century going up like that, with no end in sight. And for Australia, our population grew by 400,000 last year, which is showing no sign of levelling out, with both net migration increasing and the birth rate, births over deaths increasing as well. In terms of the issues related to climate change and per capita emissions, it does strike me that there are people who think that when the environment movement is constantly talking about climate change as human-induced, but then has nothing to say about growing human population, that it's not fair dinkum. And I think that has been damaging to the environment movement's capacity to get the collective action. And if you think about a small country town, a closed community, people might say, oh, we don't like small closed communities, but it seems to me that there is greater willingness to make sacrifices and a sense of collective endeavour than in large growing open ones, and that's been a real problem. It's true that Australia, a country like Australia, has very large per capita emissions, but I think that imposes on us a greater responsibility to make sure that our population is not increasing given the per capita impact that we have. And it's equally true, as Bronwyn says, that there are other countries that have much lower per capita emissions, but you can't have a message that says to the poor countries, you are going to stay poor, that your per capita emissions have to stay where they are. So I do see more potential in something like New Zealand, which had the net migration at 72,000, has cut it back under Jacinda Ardern to 58,000, that's conceptually easier to imagine than to say to people, you're going to stay poor indefinitely. Ian asked about solutions, so yes, the discussion about GDP, if we get the focus off growth and onto well-being, that seems to me to have a lot of potential, and looking at countries that have been able to move in that direction. I'm also a big fan, as some of the other speakers have talked about, the principle of subsidiarity, local say in decision making, and I think you get better decisions that way. And we've talked a bit about planning, but giving local communities a say in planning rather than losing it to state authorities. And I also think it's good for your mental health that people have some sense of agency, some say in what's happening in their lives, rather than decisions being made at national or even supranational levels. Another area of potential solution, or I think certainly of common ground, of people who are concerned about environment, climate change, and people who are concerned about population growth, is the question of vegetation and hanging on to our tree canopy cover, because any way you cut it, the loss of vegetation is bad for the climate, both for mitigation and adaptation, and there's no doubt that population growth and property developers rolling over everything does, as one member of the audience said, lead to the paving over of agricultural and food growing areas, as well as wrecking natural habitats. I think that's an important area. Finally, on the question of optimism and pessimism, years ago, in about 2007, I went around to lots of Labor Party branches, fancying myself as a disciple of Al Gore, telling them how bad the climate change issue was and how urgent the need for action was. And I thought I was being really persuasive, but I ended up thinking that I was way too persuasive, because people would sort of walk out of there with their heads down. They were completely flattened and beaten and thinking that we're going to hell in a handbasket. So I do think there has to be a message that's more positive than that, and I do think that people do have an appetite for hope rather than fear or greed as motivators for action, and that they are looking for political leadership focused on problem solving and on things that unite us rather than divide us, and so on. So I do think that there remains cause for optimism.